Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Cage, titled Kill the Architect. Now, as I've said a number of times in the past, I've long ago gotten sick of musical acts that are trying to shock me or scare me. Maybe it's an issue of maturity or desensitization or the fact that I've now been exposed to so many acts who base their entire appeal off of such a narrow shock spectrum, but most of these acts just do nothing for me anymore. I mean, once you start listening to black metal with acts that might genuinely be monstrous people who burn down churches, you pretty much hit the absolute extreme of material designed to shock and intimidate you. On top of that, most of the bands that tend to go for this sort of shocking subject matter, they just go to the same material time and time again. Pseudo-goth torture porn with mild flirtations with sexual violence and maybe a stint in the insane asylum. The number of albums that I've seen in this vein that just repeat this sort of subject matter over and over again, it's less scary and it's more tedious. That being said, there are a few acts that have managed to get under my skin in a good way. Eminem always springs to mind, particularly with his older stuff and especially the Marshall Mathers LP, mostly because there was always this sick undercurrent that there might be some vestige of truth to all the stories that he was telling, particularly on songs like Kim. More recently this year, I reviewed The Terror by the Flaming Lips, an incredible album that managed to scare the living hell out of me every time I listened to it, mostly because it opts for a really sick kind of psychological horror and it nails it effectively. What these two albums have in common is something that seems to be finally coming back into the horror film genre as of recently. Subtlety and pacing. The type of horror that relies on your imagination to do the dirty work and is designed to build tension with what you don't know and can't see. And you know, it's a real damn shame that you don't see more artists, particularly horrorcore rap artists, going in this direction. But then again, I'm not entirely surprised that they don't. It's tough to create the right sort of atmosphere without relying on cheap jump scares or graphic subject material. Hell, many people would argue that when Eminem made Relapse in 2009 that he was relying on just graphic subject matter just to make the album sound somewhat scary or intimidating in an attempt to recapture the old spirit from the Marshall Mathers LP. So on that note, let's talk about a rapper who has often been compared with Eminem and who actually once feuded with him. A New York horrorcore underground rapper named Cage. Like Eminem, he was an extremely skilled white rapper who drew on his life experiences to fuel the darkness of his songs. Yet unlike Eminem, there is a lot more significant trauma to Cage that he could utilize. Between drug abuse at an early age, expulsion from school, a stint at a military base in Germany, repeated beatings from his stepfather, and 16 hellish months spent within a psychiatric hospital where he was misdiagnosed and given some drugs that made him suicidal, Cage had he had more than enough terrifying subject material to draw upon, most of which came into sharp view on his superb 2005 album Hell's Winter. But after a disappointing and lackluster rap rock experiment in 2009 with Depart From Me, where Cage tried to incorporate elements of hardcore punk into his record and mostly failed, Cage has been rather quiet, only showing up in a short film backed by Kid Cudi in 2011. That was until this year, where he dropped a new album titled Kill the Architect. And really, it couldn't have come at a better time, with darker rap becoming more popular in the mainstream with the onset of trap, and his old rival Eminem dropping an album in a few weeks, which, yes, I will review. So, how does Cage's new record actually measure up? Well, it doesn't. Ugh. You know what, this is a real disappointment, because I like Cage, and because Cage's Kill the Architect is starkly, frustratingly mediocre. It's an album that shows a marked drop-off in quality, and not even in a way that's particularly interesting, which means this review is going to be pretty short. To put it another way, if Cage wants to be compared with Eminem again, this is Cage's encore, and I mean that in more ways than one. This is an album about depression and self-destruction, a midlife crisis put to music, and the parallels between this album and Eminem's misguided 2004 record are more than a little startling. Shame that's probably the only thing that's remotely shocking about this record at all. So, okay, let's begin with the biggest problem. Cage himself. Now, this guy is a technically skilled rapper, and one that often has his rhymes really come across with some inbuilt meaning. And in the past, he's delivered his verses with a fair amount of energy and menace to really suck you in and belying the grimy nastiness of his songs. Yeah, you can go ahead and pitch all of that out the window for this album, because we have yet another rapper jumping onto the deliver all rhymes with little to emotion bandwagon. And man, it backfires here. It's a striking contrast between the hardcore punk elements of the last record, as Cage delivers rhymes like he's either half asleep, drunk, stoned, or all three of them put together. I'm not gonna deny that it fits the mood of this album well, I'll come back to this, but it sure as hell isn't engaging, particularly considering that most of the content of these rhymes just isn't all that special or unique. Sure, there are elements of Cage's punk attitude, but there's a lot more bitter contempt and depression on display here when he's rapping about how even anarchy gets watered down. The interesting points on this album are when Cage actually does seem to get riled up about something. Like in Your Fur, which attacks a woman for wearing fur, but just seems to do it out of raw spite rather than any sort of animal rights fervor, which is just kind of unnerving a little bit here. And it illustrates a larger problem with this album. Outside of broad, punk-inspired themes and a couple jabs at religion, this album is incredibly unfocused. It feels like Cage is angry at something or someone, or more bitterly resentful given the lack of real explosive moments on this record, but he doesn't have a real coherent target for that anger, and thus, more often than not, it turns inward. And what's all the more striking is that he doesn't really reference his troubled history anymore. Instead, we're talking about entirely too much about drugs and his lousy sex life and how he's just stoned all the time, and that for some reason makes it good. Because he's not glamorizing that lifestyle at all. If anything, it comes across as rather sad. I'll give him points for referencing some real emotion behind the fact that he knows that some of the women that he slept with aborted his kids. Yeah, you know what? That's dark, and I can see that link in his depression. But more often than not, the album comes across with lines like, "It wasn't supposed to be this way." And you know what? I can kind of see that. Cage was probably hoping to be successful like Eminem and rise out of the underground, except that never happened. And I can understand being angry about that, considering Cage is now near his 40s and has never really experienced true success as a rapper, but none of that anger really materializes into something coherent besides just nihilistic resentment. And I'll say the same thing I said about Trent Reznor back when I reviewed Hesitation Marks. If you don't switch up your subject material or bring some sort of variety or deeper insight, nihilistic artwork gets really boring really fast. And bizarrely, that's not the only parallel I can make with Nine Inch Nails with this particular album. The song They Suck seems to be inspired lyrically by Starfuckers Inc. from The Fragile, but while Trent Reznor was targeting the shallow industry in that overwrought mess of a song, They Suck has more than a few jealous glances at the pedestal of actually making it in the industry. It actually seems like he wants to get there. And you know, it's a real shame that Cage didn't appropriate any of Reznor's production or instrumentation though, because the beats he uses on this album are really a mixed bag. This is sort of in line with the Cannabis comparison. Cannabis might be a great rapper, but he's never going to succeed because he's a lot of lousy beats, and to some extent I feel Cage falls somewhat into the same category. Now, sure, there are a few decent bits of production and a few ominous vibes that do a fair bit for enhancing the atmosphere, but the sampled fuzz-laden guitars sound sloppier than they should, and elements is tempted to sound off-putting and discordant, more often than not just sound poorly chosen and just cluttering the mix unnecessarily. And while there are a few keyboard segments that I did like, the majority of the beats on this album just sound watery, turgid, and more than a little cheap. The absolute worst track on this album comes on I Don't Know You, which has a decent drum line, but has an incredibly grating synth and echoing samples of Cage's voice that just make the song sound messy rather than complex. And to complete the encore comparison on this track, Cage sings, or rather, he tries to because he's barely on key and he sounds awful. And it's a really, really bad way to finish off an album. So in the end, Cage's Kill the Architect, I can barely recommend this album, if at all. If you're looking for songs that were decent, well, You Were the Shit in High School and This Place were they were probably my favorites, but that's hardly statement of quality when I'm dealing with this record, which really isn't very good. Frankly, I don't see a lot of Cage fans liking this album. It's nowhere near close to shocking or interesting. It sounds not all that far removed instrumentally from modern hip-hop without a lot of the grit that made Cage's early material interesting. And Cage himself sounds completely uninterested when he's not just complaining. I really hate to use this term, especially considering that I feel this album is analogous to the midlife crisis that was Eminem's Encore, but at its core, this album is emo rap, and it fits all the bad connotations of that term. I'm giving this album a 5 out of 10, and really, that feels generous. And look, I really want to like this album. I'm a fan of Cage, and it does not measure up in any way, shape, or form. And if you've just heard of Cage now and are just interested in horrorcore rap, then this album is not a good introduction to him. Go dig up Hell's Winter, because even at that album's darkest, bleakest, nastiest points, it's so much better than this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Negative reviews, but once again, these happen. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. I really appreciate everyone who's been subscribing. I never would have expected to have gotten this far. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.